With that, David Sperling, here you go.
Thank you very much, Brett. I'd just like to recognize Brett for the great work he's done putting this conference together. Thank you. And the hotel staff as well, who takes care of us year in and year out. So when you see them, thank them too. Welcome back. By popular demand, we're having a Grants 101 session today. I was asked by the membership to put this on, so here we are. The session really is intended to cover a broad range of topics, as we have a broad range of people and airports and consultants in the audience today. So with that, let me just take a brief minute. I'll introduce the panelists to you. We're going to go through a fireside chat type of conversation. And we encourage audience participation, whether you want to respond and offer examples from your community, or whether you have specific questions you would also like answered. We're here to help. So with that, we're going to go through the grants process, sort of conception to grave. And let me introduce everyone real quick, and we'll get started. Their bios are in the program. We have Mike Williams, who's the acting manager for the FAA Los Angeles Airports District Office. Laurie Suttmeier, who's the manager of the FAA San Francisco Airports District Office. Jorge Rubio is the interim deputy director of airports for the city of San Diego. Barney Helmick, airport director, Flagstaff Pulliam Airport. And Lance McIntosh, department manager for Western Region Engineering from CNS Companies. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for agreeing to be on the panel. And we're just going to get started real quick here with throw out the first question of the panel and see where this thing goes. I guess the principles of project development, like how, right, in the grant process, how do you even identify the project? How do you get it into the grant cycle? Where does it start? And we'll just throw that out to Barney.
Okay, I'm going to mention a little book that most of us have done here called a master plan. I try as much as possible to stay to that master plan, because if I don't, then I have a lot more difficulty getting the project approved for a grant. Now, going through that master plan, it takes a lot of communication with your stakeholders, with the sponsors, because I may be the director, but I'm not the only sponsor involved with our airport. So I try to get as much work done ahead of time and look at what we're going to be doing, projecting into the future, and that's where I use that master plan the most for that.
Well, what I can tell you is the master plan is very vital for an airport to continue, and that's basically how you plan the airport out, and you have gotten the input that Barney is talking about. But then the other thing that happens is you have to look at the condition of your pavement. You have to not only talk to the stakeholders locally, but also the FAA, and work on that airport capital improvement program. And depending on how much money the federal government has for you and the local match, that's basically, I mean, everything plays into how you're going to be handling your projects. And it may be a lot, but if it's done with coordination, you'll have a successful project.
So from the ADO's point of view, successful projects usually begin at least a year to 2 years, depending on the complexity of the project, in advance. Absolutely, it begins with the planning process and the master plan and or narrative report, and hopefully that report is providing you the data that you need, and also the trigger point for that need. Let's just say it's a runway extension. Hopefully the master plan or your planning documents would provide you when would be the right time to be asking for that project. And then that timing is not in a particular fiscal year, it's when you start kicking off the effort to explore the justification, the eligibility, the length, the design criteria, the scope of work for that particular project. And as I said, that may be done at least a couple of years in advance so that we could also match your needs with the finances that we may or may not have available. So it takes close communication, but it absolutely begins with a strong planning effort.
I'd kind to like to kick it out to the audience on this one. And, you know, going through the master planning process, as Barney said, there's a lot of stakeholders. And I would kind of like to get a take, if anyone's ever been through a master plan where a lot of the projects or the development that was a result of the master plan was driven by something other than airport management's vision for the airport. Has that ever happened to anyone in the room? Would you like to share with, we're supposed to have a microphone running around.
Good afternoon. I am actually currently going through this process right now. Visalia Municipal Airport, we're city-owned and operated. I serve at the pleasure of City Council, and I'm running into that situation where their desires is not what's best for the airport, and I struggle a little bit with trying to make them understand that not only is that not what's best for the airport, but I won't get grant funding for that, and they still want me to push for grant applications for those things, and it's a situation where I know internally I'm going to be laughed at by the FAA to apply for those things, runway extensions when we don't have commercial service or an absolute need for it, access roads when it's clearly that's not going to happen because of where they want it compared to our RPZ zones. I mean, I really struggle with that recently, and it's I'm working on how to navigate through it. I'm working with the FAA.
Way to go, Eric.
I'm working with our, the San Francisco ADO as well, trying to kind of come up with a game plan.
So what we'd like to do, the whole purpose of the Grants 101 is kind of share experiences, offer a little bit of advice. So I don't know if it's appropriate for me to hand the microphone over to one of the FAA folks, but if there's anyone else in the room who has run into this before that would like to offer their perspective on how this was handled at their airport, that would be outstanding. And it has to have happened to somebody else.
And I would ask that we start at the table with either Barney or Jorge to begin with to talk about that and how to deal with your city management and maybe elected officials as well on managing expectations, which harkens back to the session we had earlier.
Well, I'll share an example that we had when I was in Ventura County. So in about the year 2000, Oxnard Airport had about 14 flights, and they were 15-minute flights from Oxnard to LAX. And they were on United and American, so that people would connect and go somewhere else. I found interesting that that concept is coming back after the airlines left the airport. But nonetheless, what happened is at that time, the historic district that's under the approach path of the airport, they wanted to close the airport. They thought it was a nuisance and the aircraft were really noisy. And it took airport management and some of the elected officials who actually were running the airport, not the city itself, to get together to convince that we are an economic engine, that we provide benefits to the community, that we are not only there to provide services to the rich guys who own an airplane, but actually to provide medical transport, to help with the fires. But anyway, so what happened is in the year 2010, we were able to relocate a displaced threshold, and a displaced threshold existed that was 1,500 feet long, so basically only smaller aircraft were able to land there, and we were able to move it about 1,000 feet back, but that took a lot of effort, and obviously, if you ask me, you may be the airport manager and people may try to dictate what you do, but in the end, the airport belongs to the community. And if the community doesn't like your airport or you're not able to get that message across, then you're really going to have issues with any projects that you have in the future. I mean, it took a long time for us to move the threshold. We did it, but it was with a lot of work. And there's other things that also affect projects, but I'll let Barney speak a little bit on it. Hi, Barney.
Oh, I actually was going to go a little bit different direction with my response here, in that when we talked about the master plan, and there's going to be a lot of steps that we're going to miss here, so please ask the questions, please bring up the comments, but something that I find when I do a master plan that's very helpful is with a lot of our projects, they're straightforward, but there's an environmental piece to it. And if I've got that identified in my master plan, it helps me with that environmental step. I can often get by with just a CAT-X because I've already done it and vetted it out through that master plan. And I think that's an important piece to remember, that there's a lot of steps in there such as that they're very critical in that planning process.
So Mike or Laurie, we'll go to the audience right here. If you can just hang on 1 second for a microphone, please. But I think it's for people who are live streaming.
You mentioned the environmental with the master plan. Since I'm relatively new to this position, but is my understanding that environmentals only have a certain shelf life on them, and since the master plans usually extend way in advance for a particular project, doesn't that supersede what the environmental status is?
So yes, the environmental review itself has a shelf life. But I think what Barney is speaking to, and I've seen this done out in the field, and it's really worked very nicely, is when you're scoping your planning, your master plan effort, or narrative report, but if you're scoping your planning effort, and let's just say that you have a sense that there might be some sensitive cultural resources on the airfield or some plant or so, if you do whether it's a wetland review during the planning process or your cultural resources survey during the planning process, you will at least know what you've got on the field. So if you're planning a taxiway extension, if that happened to be heading into those sensitive plants, you're still in the planning role. You'll know to back off of that and maybe come up with something else. As well, once you have the product from those studies done and you finish your master plan, then when the trigger comes for that particular project, even though you're not doing the environmental survey, the actual environmental, you're doing the surveys that support the environmental, you'll have that to feed into the environmental, which will help the environmental go much more smoothly.
Yeah, which in turn helps you plan your ASIP, because then you know the timing of the environmental versus when you can start your design and move into construction.
Thanks, Lance. That actually segues very nicely into the next thing I was thinking about throwing out to everybody is how you deal with the changing priorities in your CIP, right? So you go through the master plan, you develop your 5-year CIP, maybe things aren't developing at your airport, progressing as you had expected. So how do you deal with adjusting priorities in your CIP after it's already been published in a master plan, say?
Well, as much as FAA's not going to like me saying this, but my CIP becomes very fluid. Everything I tried to do in the first 24 months, I want it to be pretty solid. But after that, and I'll give an example. We just, 3 years ago, we had a runway that was starting to deteriorate, and it deteriorated extremely quickly. It was not on our CIP. It was not identified in the master plan. But because of that failure and our immediate reaching out and talking to my planner and engineer and bringing in the supporting evidence of it, we were able to make that change rather quickly in the CIP. But things like that come up that you're not going to be planning for. A runway that's failing, a change in your lighting system that you may need to, or that famous AC that comes out of Oklahoma City that says you're going to repaint every 6 months. Things like that come up, and you've got to be able to work on the fly, but you still need to justify it. You need to communicate with your planners, with your engineers. My planner, Jared, are you in the room? Jared and I know each other on a face-to-face basis. I call him almost weekly, and yeah, but that's different because I'm begging for money. But you need to know those people. You need to communicate with them and let them know as quick as possible. It may still even change. You may find that runway is not quite as bad as you thought it is, but if I don't tell him right away, he can't start communicating up the system to where the money's coming from, that this may be coming in as an emergency. So talk right away.
So what I think you know, the point that, you know, Barney's really driving at, it's about the relationship. It's about the relationship between your airport and the community it resides in, and speaking, you know, on behalf of representing currently L.A., it's about that relationship. You know, do you have that relationship where you can pick up the telephone, no emails, pick up the telephone, and talk with the appropriate person, whether that be the planner, engineer, or get to the ADO manager, but can you talk about what's going on? You need to have that rapport. You need to have the relationship. You need to be able to say, I know this is what it says, but this is what's happening. Here's what's going, and how can you work together in a strategy to try and address that? Now, that doesn't mean the answer is going to be yes. We might not be able to get there as quickly, but you have to have the relationship to start that conversation. You have to be able to look at it and look at it different ways and be open to feedback. And some of the feedback might be, okay, we need a little more justification in this, or, you know, can we look at some timing? But none of that happens without the relationship.
Great.
That's a good point.
You gonna add to that, Laurie?
Yeah. A couple of thoughts. So the ADOs, all offices across the country, are not against moving a living ACIP document. It's the surprise that comes in the fall of that particular funding year when we're thinking that you're going to go with Project X and you want to switch to Project Y. And if it's an emergency, we will try working with it. But as Mike said, we may not have the funding. We've got to be able to match the funding with the project. So again, we're not opposed to the ACIP moving. There is the effort for the justification. Okay, so in the normal process of applying for a project, you identify your projects in your planning. Then when the trigger happens or there's a need for a particular project that came out of the master plan, now you go through the justification, the eligibility, you bring some of the very early designs to the FAA. We talk about it to figure out the timing on the thing. Once we all agree that this is a good project, it moves into the environmental. That might be a Cat X. It comes out of the environmental, now you complete the design. If we're building up to, we've been talking for a couple of years for a taxway extension, and then all of a sudden, as Barney said, you've got runway work. We understand that we need to adjust, but we can't financially, generally, depending on the size of this, just move those monies to that. So there may be a delay, but it's a lot better to work with the projects that are needed at the airport and the timing at the airport than thrust a project at a sponsor because it was in the CIP for 3 years, so thou shalt do this project. So we want to work with you. We need the time on our side. We also have a responsibility to review designs, plans, and specs, get the project airspace, and all of that can't happen in a couple of months, aside from the finances. So it all takes planning, and as Mike was saying, he was stressing, it is the communication piece that's ultra important. When there's a project that's going to slip, communicate with us, and it may take several sessions for us to figure out what do we need to do to help this slip.
Great, thank you. I do want to circle back around. We sort of have come in a little circle, but I do want to ask the FAA representatives up here specifically about what types of help they can offer to airport sponsors when they're having trouble communicating in their own communities. And I know it's something that largely you have try and stay out of, but how can you help?
We are the government. We're here to help. At least they're awake. Okay, that's good. Again, from my perspective, it goes back to the relationship. And are you able to come in so we can have a conversation around the subject and understand what the issue is and have really, we got to have a frank, honest discussion about what it is. Sometimes, you know, if you were in the previous session, you heard Mr. Rondinella talk about finding someone bigger than you to take on some of the fights. And sometimes having the agency step in can help that process. Sometimes you need the agency to tell your stakeholders why things aren't grant eligible versus you. Probably going to tell them the same exact thing. So, you know, it can happen, but it's about, again, from my perspective, it always comes back to the relationship and how we can partner and support you in your community. And you know, you have to be able to have that exchange, understand. Sometimes at the ADO level, it makes sense for us to reach up and have Robin Hunt or Mark McClarty step in on an issue and help us with the communication. So it, you know, I can't tell you that the answer is always yes. I can't tell you the answer is always no, because it's very situation dependent, and we have to have that conversation and be able to understand what's going on.
So I had heard at some point in my career the phrase, I got to remember exactly how it goes. Yes to the need, no to the ask. That being that you might come to us with you've got a particular problem, and you thought that this extra taxiway or a larger apron or another fuel system is going to solve it. We may have to say no to the ask because it's something that's not AIP eligible. And we're all human beings. Everybody in every one of our offices across the country handles questions differently. Some are more apt or they have better abilities in being able to explain why something's a no. Others work to try to address the need. So you come in, and if you're getting an answer from the ADO that is just an email, thanks, Gresham, but no. And now you're left wondering why. And as I heard a consultant say, sometimes they feel like they're just throwing spaghetti at a fridge, hoping that something will stick, one of the projects or the type of project or whatever. If we're not addressing your need, then again, as Mike said, it's all about the communication. Let's have a conversation. Issues shouldn't have to rise to Robin and Mark. We should be able to handle it at the ADO, and we should be able to work with you to figure out what is the root cause of your issue, and maybe there's another approach that is eligible at your facility and something that we can fund. Just you put more eyes and more brain power towards the situation instead of just a quick no. Oh, Robin's. Oh, I must have said something.
Boy, Robin's hand went up.
I did.
Just one other point is sometimes in the Office of Airports, we end up being a matchmaker, if you will, whereas you may have a question at your local airport, and it may be something that's related to another part of aviation, and you need to engage some expertise from air traffic, aircraft certification, instrument procedures, the list goes on and on and on. And there are times where we end up being the matchmaker to put you in touch with the appropriate expert, because you know, we're not going to get into fields that we're not expert in. But again, we can sometimes be that matchmaker.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you, Laurie. I guess I just want to say, Mark and I tend to always try to tell people, work it out at the ADO, work it out at the local level. That being said, we're not opposed to coming and speaking with your board, with your city council, and explaining to them why the answer is no, that you're not crazy. We really are saying no. I mean, we've had a lot of airports over the years. No, the answer is no, but ask us so that we can write a letter that says in writing the no and the why. We always try to say the why. And we have other people that are like, I know this is crazy. We're trying to work something out with the military. And we push it as far as we can to get what we think is best for the airport. Sometimes we win. Sometimes we know we're out there on the little twig at the edge with you. But we're out there with you, and we really do and want to help where we can, because we're not, again, we're following rules that we didn't write, Congress wrote, but, you know, we're all trying to reach the same goal.
Great, thank you. So from the airport sponsor's perspective, Jorge and Barney, if you have a project that's you thought was going to get queued up and then you find out it's not funded, obviously the word relationship's going to come back in here and dealing with everyone you need to. But how do you approach that if you really think you need that project funded?
My advice to you would be don't only reach out to the ADO when you have an issue, when you have a problem. Keep constant communication with them, even when you're having a project that you're working on that's a normal project that you don't have any issues with, and invite them, bring them over to the airport, tell them how the project is doing, provide them with updates so that you have that relationship. And when you have a problem that is difficult to solve or you need assistance, you can leverage that relationship and potentially get some help. The other situation I think that many airports are going to see now is the fact that, like Robin said, you didn't write the rules. So the advisory circular 53A is very different to what it was before, and there are so many restrictions as to what the FAA planners can fund. But I know that if an airport has a need in the future about maybe the forecast is not the proper forecast, or maybe numbers need to be updated, they will work with you. So in a sense, I would say keep the relationship alive with everyone, and you'll be able to get things done a little bit better that way.
I'm very fortunate, and I'm working with my airport staff's small, but we have some people in our community, in our city, that do my grant writing and a good project manager. And so sometimes we will have a project. We're less likely to have projects that come up that are not going to be grant eligible as to the timing of the grant eligibility of it. So there's, for the students especially, there's different colors of money in the grant process. We have our entitlements, we have discretionary money, and you can roll your entitlements, 3 years, I believe it is. So sometimes it's a matter of juggling when that project's going to go into effect, just so that I've got enough entitlements, because the discretionary money is harder to come up with. And the FAA is better explaining this, but I love this whole thing about how the money comes out of the system. The runway project I mentioned, we have snow in Arizona. We get about 100 inches up where I live at. And so that means I can't do asphalt or concrete for 6 months out of the year. So if I ask for the project and the grant cycle doesn't match my construction, I may have to wait 2 whole years. So I'm going to look at, do I roll that money? And then that gives them a chance to look for discretionary money. We also talk to some of our sister airports in the neighborhood, see if they're not going to use entitlements, things like that, to see if we can get the money for it. But as far as not having grant eligible projects, we've been pretty fortunate with that. I've had more problems with PFC eligibility than I've had with grants, but I think it's really an interesting process to listen to how that 5-year plan is planned out nationally for where all that money's going to go, and that's why it's hard to slide these projects around there.
Lance, how do you help a sponsor when you're working through that?
Well, what was the question? No, you know, you never know if a project, the timing shifts. You don't know when that money's coming from the FAA. The best thing that you can do, and it all keeps coming back to what Mike said, you got to communicate, got to communicate, got to communicate. Now, they don't have all the answers because they're in some respects, they are at the mercy of Congress, and there's a lot of stuff that's going on behind the scenes to get that money released. So they may not be able to get you an exact date on when this money's coming, if this money's coming. They can't give that guarantee. They provide their guidance, this is our best guess, and you know, it may or may not happen. But you have to plan for multiple scenarios. So if we are told to expect a grant in May, there are some options that you can do to, when you're bidding the project, such as extending the length of time that you can hold the bids. Now that's going to increase prices a little bit, because if you ask a contractor to hold his bid prices steady for 120 or 180 days versus 90 days, he has to make sure he's covered, you know, in case of market conditions, prices go up. But you can do that. You also have the ability to bid it in May with the shorter hold, 90 days, say. And if that 90 days expires and the money's still not there, then you can cancel, reject all the bids, you know, circle back with the FAA and possibly bid it again later in the year and hope that you get through with the second cycle of money. So there's a lot of different scenarios. The other major issue that or I shouldn't say issue, strategy to use when you're bidding projects is the use of alternate bids. So you base bid with some alternates. In case you do get higher than expected prices, you are still at least able to do a portion of the project without losing the entire project. Now, if prices come in great, you can add those alternates on, use up, you know, if FAA is able to even come up with even more money, you can actually expand that project beyond what you originally expected to go, as long as it's included in the bid.
Just one thing. So over the last several years, we all have been dealing with, I guess, uncertainty surrounding the AIP program. However, remember, we're now in the third year of a 5-year reauthorization bill. 5 years. This current federal fiscal year is and has been fully funded by Congress. So this year, and in past years, even with the whatever the funding cycle might be, the guidance that we have been giving out is open your bids May 1st. Now, y'all have to stay tuned to Robin's presentation, because I can tell you the dates are moving up. And that is moving up in a national perspective. So again, we have a full year. You know, we're looking at doing some grants. Actually, there's some actual programming behind the scenes taking place right now. So we're looking to get those grants out much earlier in the year. And particularly, you know, and again, like Barney said, it does snow in Arizona and it does snow in northern Nevada. If the grant gets issued earlier in the year, you can do the construction that same year, which leads to what I consider a Grants 101 thing, which is talking about the performance on the grant. And the easiest way to tell if the grant's performing is, are the dollars being converted into an asset? So if we get started earlier, we do the construction that year, we get it wrapped up before the snow flies in the fall. If we're done, we're done. If there's a little bit of, has to clean up after the winter cycle, then that's okay. You know, we can work with that. So again, you're gonna see more and more focus on getting that project out to bid, out for, you know, construction sooner. I mean, let's all remember that is what we're trying to do here. So we're all trying to convert dollars into an asset. That's ultimately where we're trying to get to. So, you know, we want to see that happen. That's why there's all this long list. Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. Nice to know I'm keeping you awake. Yeah, I think you said bless his heart in that remark there, Joe. And it's okay because Joe and I known each other. Yeah. I'm just going to quit on that note.
That's great. We'll take this opportunity to shift gears a little bit too. So, right.
Just derailed everything again, Joe.
Yeah,
You just,
thanks, Joe.
Just
Appreciate it. And we're not above calling on you either. So, you're welcome. So, considering that the conference theme is around best practices, Gary Peterson's message to us earlier that we're all unique and no two airports are the same, no two individuals are the same. Now's the time when we're also going to ask for some audience participation as well to share that diversity. We can start up here with the panel. How do you handle, and we'll start with the airport sponsors represented up here, how do you guys handle grant administration, the mechanics of it? Is it from applications to reimbursements to reporting internally within your airport organization, or is it a function in another group in your organization? If you could, describe how it works for you, and then we can see if anybody else wants to share, so we can all get some learning.
What I can tell you is I know how it works in Ventura. I'm learning in San Diego. So when you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport, and you're totally right about that. But what I can tell you, in Ventura, we had our own internal department. We had 34 people. We had a projects administrator. You had a deputy director and the director who really worked on projects. And the way that it was administered is and actually we had an on-call consultant that helped us put the bid packages together. So we had the project manager or the consultant who would submit the applications, and then it would go to the fiscal department that we have, and they would handle the withdrawals of the grant, and they would go online to the system. And we, as far as planning it out, would be the deputy director would go down to and the projects manager would go down to the FAA's office to plan the projects out. So it was a fairly simple process. Down in San Diego, we don't have the positions filled yet. I am on an interim basis, the acting interim deputy director, which is the #1 position, but I was hired as the #2, the projects guy. So I'm doing a little bit of everything. We just finished a master plan for each of the airports, Montgomery, Gibbs, and Brownfield. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting that you mentioned this because we had one of the entitlement amounts that was supposed to expire this year. So we didn't really have a project assigned for it. So when we met with the ADO's office team, they allowed us to actually put in for an airport sweeper, which is kind of like good because the airport had contract sweepers and the airports have contract sweepers, and I think we're looking to move away from that to get more consistency. But we submit for the grant, and once the grant gets awarded, it actually goes downtown, and Public Works are the administrators of how the project will take place, and once the project takes place, well, we then close the grant. So it's a little different.
I'm going to go into the weeds a little bit with the way we do it in Flagstaff, in that I have my grants manager, my projects manager, my accountant, and procurement officers. As soon as we start talking with our CIP and we know that we're going to get a grant up there, my grant manager's applying for the grant, I immediately contact my accountant and establish a credit line in there. We do that line item in there so that anything we do from that point in time forward is tracked financially. Then my procurement officer is going to go out with the bids, and they're going to put a requisition together, and then the requisition is going to have a PO for the project. And I'm saying all this because for the students, this is extremely critical. It's important for you to know where every single penny in that project went, because you're going to get audited. So we establish all that timeline there, and we'll go through with it. Once the money is guaranteed has come forward, we're going to start with our project manager doing the daily payrolls and all the accounting processes for that project, working with our contractors and our consultants to make sure that everything is double-checked and triple-checked. Then we're going to pay them, and then we're going to be getting reimbursed. We don't get paid up front for the grant. We pay for it, and then we get reimbursed. And then at the end of that process, every one of those steps is audited, because I'm going to be requested to have an audit for that on that project. So at the end of that closeout, then my engineer and planner are going to come up and double check to make sure the project is a real asset and that it meets the standards, and then we're ready to go and we're finished. So kind of down in the weeds, but it's critical to know those steps.
So now I'm going to go up to the real world for most folks in the audience. Who does not have entire departments to handle their grants and reimbursement requests and have to do it on their own? Okay, does someone want to share their process out in the audience? Or I can do a generic one. Typically, the consultants play a large role in that, and the sponsor has to have a lot of trust in the consultant to prepare those documents accurately, because ultimately it's the sponsor who submits and certifies to all that paperwork that gets submitted to the FAA, Caltrans, ADOT as well, the state agencies. They're ultimately responsible, not the consultant. So there's a lot of trust that has to go on there, and as well as a lot of oversight on both sides. The sponsor needs to kind of oversee the consultant, but the consultant has a role to also oversee what the sponsor's doing. We can't have a submit documentation to a sponsor and then it goes into a black hole. There always needs to be follow-up to make sure that everything that was given to the sponsor was actually executed properly. So it's a system of checks and balances that, as a consultant, we work with the sponsor to make sure happens. Grant reimbursement requests is a good example. If we fill one out for overseeing construction administration, we monitor construction quantities. We'll certify them to the sponsor, certify the pay request, prepare the grant reimbursement, give it to the sponsor, but a lot of times that's where our involvement ends. And 3 months later, contractor may give us a phone call and say, hey, we still haven't been paid, what's going on? And of course we don't know because we put it into the black hole. So that's where that communication piece comes back into play. Does anyone want to share or did I pretty much get it for a lot of folks?
We see the airport sponsors out here.
Yeah.
And we understand you didn't volunteer to be on the panel, so that's okay. So outside of those mechanics of actually going through the grant paperwork that the FAA requires and all those steps, how do you get through the grant acceptance process in your own communities, right? So do you have to go and ask permission? Do you have to get council approval? Is the city manager capable of approving the grant application, the grant acceptance, et cetera? And what sort of roadblocks and types of issues do you see with that?
Sorry. In the Ventura County community, the ASIP actually needs to be approved by the Board of Supervisors, and in order to get there, you have to prepare it internally. Actually, there's a step before that. The administrative process is that you prepare the ASIP for the county internally, and you send it to the CEO's office. And then what we would do is we would actually go through our Airport Advisory Commission and get approval or recommendation from them so that we can take the item to the Board of Supervisors and so that the Board of Supervisors can approve the CIP. Now, between those two bodies, we had an airport authority for each of the airports. And we needed to also take the item through the airport authority, so they would also provide recommendation to take it to the Board of Supervisors. Before the item went in front of the Board of Supervisors, we would actually go through the attorney's offices and the CEO's office finance team to review it. And then once they blessed it, then the supervisors would be able to vote on the item. And that's actually for CIP. That's for any grant acceptances that we did. We didn't necessarily go through that process in order to apply for a grant because the CIP was enough in Ventura. Now, in San Diego, it's a little different. We actually don't need to go through the airport advisory committee, but what we do is we let them know what we're doing so that we don't blindside them. We do have a committee, and that's a land and house committee. I haven't been through it yet, but Charlie, who's over here from our staff, can probably clarify what that is. And after that happens, they actually, for grant acceptance, he needs to go through City Council, and City Council actually approves it there. So we have less steps in San Diego. In Ventura, it was a little longer, but in Ventura, the ASIP needed to be approved by the board. In San Diego, not necessarily just the grant acceptance.
So, you know, as an airport sponsor, all of you pretty much work for some type of public agency, and all public agencies have steps and processes and bureaucracy that you have to work through. And then you have things where the city council goes dark and holds no meetings during the month of August. So to Lance's question, and this is things that, you know, I ask of my ADO staff, so when these questions come back to you, they're usually coming from me, but, you know, have you gone to your governing body? Do you have approval to accept the grant? Do you have the approval to execute the grant? Is that something that you have to take back before your public body, or can the city manager or some person sign on that behalf? And it's different in Arizona, it's different in Nevada, and it's different in California, and it's different in the Pacific Islands as well. So do you understand all those steps? You know, I can tell you in my past life, when I worked for one of the public agencies, the deadline to submit the staff report on the item was due 60 days prior to the item being calendared. So do you understand all those dates and milestones? You know, you could probably lean on your really smart consultants and get them to help you with that. But it's important that you understand those steps, because if we miss one and it's towards the end of the year and you can't accept the grant, then, you know, it's going to get pulled back and we're going to have to start over next year. But it's really important that you understand all those steps. And then again, I'll go back to my relationship and communicationship piece.
Thank you. Chris, I was going to pick on you because I know you have some experience with this too, but I'm also going to save you because we're short on time. And so since we're talking about Grants 101, we have about 5 minutes left. Seems appropriate to talk about grant closeout at this time. And Barney, I know you alluded to record keeping and getting audited and all that, but tell us about some of the issues and processes that you use to get those grants closed out appropriately.
Wow. It's construction projects, even though we have weather cycles, tend to go smoother for us for closeout. I mentioned that runway project, and the project from start to finish, minus the money, was about 4 years. But the money, we actually didn't receive the money until about 30 days into the project, and then we received a third of it. Then another third later on, and then a final third after the project was closed out. But we actually got that project started and closed out in the same calendar year. Well, actually, I think we rolled into the next calendar year by 1 or 2 months because there was some paperwork that we had to follow up on. It's other items that are more difficult. We've purchased some snowblower equipment, an ARF vehicle, and those vendors oftentimes have long lead times, and it's very hard to get that done, even in a 4-year cycle. So it comes back to, as Mike said, I got to communicate. I call Jared often and say, look, you know, our vehicle, yeah, we put the procurement together like 3 years ago, but they're running behind. So make sure he understands, so we're not locking up money that could be used somewhere else. Otherwise, it's a matter of making sure that my project manager has got all these paperwork in as quickly as possible. My finance people have made the payments and have got their documents so that we can get those in for payment back from the FAA as quickly as possible, and that the audits have already started, so we're ready to close out as quick as possible.
And there are also, the FAA has some published, some of the state agencies do as well. There are some pretty detailed process checklists that are out there that can be used, even if you're relying on a consultant to do most of the work for the closeout. You should still go through and check the boxes, every single one of them. Because I guarantee you that an auditor will. So you need to make sure you're keeping track of it as well.
Well, I think you've covered it really well. The only thing that I can tell you is the planning grants, they take a little longer sometimes, especially when you're dealing with master plans because of the community involvement aspect of it. So it takes a little longer to close out, but if you're dealing with a straight, project acquisition, project built out or acquisition of equipment, it's a little bit sooner. Yeah, that's my experience.
Mike, Laurie, do you have any advice on project closeout?
There's a lot of expertise in the room, and talk to those people in the room, because if you don't know, I'll guarantee you there's somebody in this room here who, if they don't know the answer, they know somebody that knows the answer.
Good enough. So we have just 1 minute left, but we could stretch that into 2 or 3 if we had some good questions coming from the audience. We're going to sit here for 60 seconds then.
I'll actually throw a plug in there. Over the next year or so, we will be updating the best practices guide for the Western Pacific region. We're hoping to bring that into, I guess, the 2020s, with some checklists and the processes. And it will be fairly detailed. There'll be some flow charts inside the document that you can refer to. So be looking for that in roughly a year or so. It will provide a great deal of guidance. The group that's working on that, there's a core group of about 14 folks made up of all the different organizations across Arizona, California, and Nevada. So that is in the works, and it is coming forward.
Gladys has a question? A comment? Can we get a microphone over?
I think a lot of the times in the grants, a lot of us kind of managed it, and one of the things we didn't speak about was your cash flow scheduling and making sure that you understand on the reimbursable side of the house where you're at and how to do that too. I think sometimes we take for granted the system over, and they haven't stressed it a lot right now, but the sponsor is ultimately responsible to pay that contractor when you're supposed to pay them based on the contractual agreement, and a lot of the times we wait. Usually they've been really good these past years on the federal side, and for some of us who have the state side, sometimes there's hiccups there when you've got those reimbursables. So I think the biggest thing is remember your obligations and then not come back to the agencies and feel that it's their fault when you should understand that cash flow portion of it and your obligations. And then also managing the CIP, I think if you're transparent inside of the communication portion of where the hiccups might be, or if you foresee a change order happening, which I know that's a cuss word, but I think that some of the things that a lot of us forget, smaller airports, we kind of manage our own CIPs. We may have the luxury of hiring a consultant, and then sometimes some of us take it on because it's a little bit easier to bring in-house and train and get people educated, because ultimately the sponsor's responsible for it. But I think that some of us, especially in different states that have that reimbursable with the state side, the cash flow issues are some things, or the scheduling of it is something that you need to pay attention to, so you allot for that and know when you need to submit that and then have the paperwork in there. And the checklist is excellent. So all of the airports are willing to show you, and for the students, it's a huge part that nobody wants to learn administratively. It's tedious. There's a lot of quality assurance there, and so we're always happy to have another set of eyes, but it's most definitely complex, even though it doesn't seem like it.
Thanks, Gladys. Yeah, so it was on our list to get to, and we've just run out of time, so we appreciate it. It's like I shared it with you earlier. With that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to the panelists, Jorge, Mike, Laurie, Lance, and Barney. And if you have any other questions, I'm sure they'll be around to help you. Thank you.